Well, hello everybody. This is the Empirical Audiophile. Well, Expona 2024 is now over with, and it is a big show compared to the Florida audio show that they have here in Florida. And they have lots of vendors, a lot of people selling things at the show. And of course, you always, when you go to these shows, you always see the best of show. Now, there are other videos out there that will tell you what the best of show is and everything else. I'm not going to get into that because there's already plenty of people, and we know that most of things like that are all somebody's opinion of what is best or what is not best of show. I've been doing this a very long time, like I explained, going to these shows. In fact, here's one of my old, from 1999, press passes with a stereophile Lancer on it. And this is one of my old press passes that, and it used to be called the Home Theater and Specialty Audio Show before it was called Expona. So this goes back a long way of me doing and writing about and commenting about stereo equipment and everything else, which is something I wanted to bring up now. The show in Florida and the show in Chicago, they're both great shows. If you've never been, if you have a chance to go to either one of them, do it. If you're an audiophile, do it. But there's a lot of things you can learn at these shows, and I thought I would let you in on something about myself a long time ago and what happens when you progress into this hobby. Now let me explain to you. You know, when a long time ago I had a big huge Pioneer receiver that cost me like $860 at the time, and I remember when I already had the receiver, or maybe I didn't have the receiver at the time. Maybe I had Macintosh at the time. Okay, all in wood boxes, and I had some L-Tech speakers. And this goes back a while, back in the 70s. I remember when I saw the Marantz 2500 receiver, and that has an oscilloscope on it, and I thought that is the neatest looking receiver I have ever seen. And remember, I lived in that time period, so I got to see Samsui, Pioneer, Samsui, Pioneer, and then you would have your Marantz and Kenwood. I mean, these receivers, they all look great. They did. They hands down, these are beautiful pieces of machinery. Well made, very heavy. I think my receiver weighed at least 70 pounds for that receiver. Had big transformer in it. I mean, it was a monster, that Pioneer was. And I know they sell them today, very expensive price if they've been redone. But I do remember the 2500 Marantz. That was before Marantz sold out the Super Scope. And it was just like, wow, man, I wish I had the money for this receiver. I forgot how much it costs, but back in those days, I thought I had a great system. I remember I had to sell off my Macintosh to go to school, afford money to go to college, so I sold it off my L-Tech Macintosh. I had a Technics turntable, and then shortly after that, I rebought the L-Tech Voice of the Theaters back in 1975. I went and bought the Pioneer receiver, the big one, SX1250, I think it was. Maybe I could be wrong on that number. And then I got a Technics turntable with a Staten Triple E cartridge. Now, if you think about it, the Technics turntable was a nice direct drive turntable. The Staten Triple E cartridge, you know, it's a decent cartridge, you know, but it's not a top of the line cartridge. I think back then it's probably 60 or 80 bucks for a cartridge. That for the whole one, the the stylus, everything, came with it. And I thought I was in audiophile heaven, And I listened to it. Back then, you only had records and stuff like that. And I thought I was doing good. Until one day, I went to a salon. Now, there was lots of places you could buy stereo equipment. And I wouldn't call them a salon. They were just places like Hi-Fi Hutch and Simply, not Simply Stereo, Hi-Fi Hutch, but there was a few of them. CNC, different places you can go. I remember Radio Shack, Allied Radio Shack was one of them I'd go to. And you have to remember that these places where you bought stereo equipment, they would just set them out, tons of speakers and a bunch of equipment, and just switch switches so you can listen to what receiver and what speaker you wanted to listen to, and that's how you did it. Until I went to my first salon where the specialized equipment that I read about, such as Wadia, Krell, Conrad Johnson, Jeff Rowland, you looked at this equipment like, wow, I've never seen this equipment. And it's a shame that a lot of these places, like for example, like the Hi-Fi Hutch, okay, that was the name of a place, that they had all these speakers and they would have your top-notch horns back then. At least you would think they were top-notch horns would be your clips, okay? And I like clips, okay? No matter, and whenever clips gave a speaker to a magazine, they didn't get that great of reviews. The reviews were so-so, okay? And I like clips, okay? Like the Laskellas, the Bellas, or the corner horns, all the topper ones of the line. And as far as the way they looked and how neat they were, and no matter what anybody said, I thought, I like them, okay? Then I heard them with tube equipment, and it was like, wow. Because most of the time you listen to them, clips, yeah, you would hear them off of like Nakamichi, or you would hear them off of a stereo receiver, and I can understand where they weren't that impressive. Until you really heard them with like tubes, good tubes or something, then it was like, well, wow, these sound a lot better than what I heard at the middle of the road shops, I'll call them, okay? Good shops, middle of the road shops, until you go to a high-end shop. And like I said, first time I went to a salon, a high-end shop, where they had like Avalon speakers, they had Kimber cable, the Black Pearl, those are $15,000 a pair for 8-foot pair, to give you an idea. And Avalon's with Premier 8s, and then a Wadia going directly into the Premier. The first time I sat down and listened to a top-notch system, not one where you go to a place that's middle of the road and you have a salesman saying, oh, doesn't that sound good? Yeah, those are real good. And this, they're trying to sell you a product. I understand that, like a car salesman trying to sell you a product. But, definitely when you go to a high-end salon, they don't have to sell you a product, really. They have the products already that they know sound good. And I remember the first time I learned what a good system sounds like. So once I heard that, I had some of the CDs that they had played for me off the Wadia, and I had to even borrow one. That was Jazz at the Pawn Shop. And the rest I had at home. And I hurried up and ran home. Wasn't that far away. And immediately I played it off of my LTEX and stuff, and no. I was fooling myself. I was only tricking my own self-conscious that I had a great system. And I have to admit, I was mad, disappointed that I thought I had this great system. You know, you got these big L-Techs, they're huge, and you got the 15-inch woofer, and you got this big, huge 17-inch horn, and you got these Avalons that beat the crap out of them. These smaller Avalons, you know, so they were only so big, you know, but they were built like a tank, and they just beat the crap out of them. And it's like, wow, you know, I thought I had a good system. And in reality, I had just a mediocre system. And I had already convinced myself it was a good system. And I realized, this is not the sound I want. You know, this is terrible. And I remember going back to the salon thinking I need new speakers or whatever. And he said, oh, wait a second. He said, you don't need new speakers. You just need better equipment. You need better transmission of that equipment as far as cabling goes, interconnects goes. And I thought I had top of the line interconnects and cabling for my speakers. After all, I had monster cable, you know, and I paid a good price for them. And he brought over Kimber cable and everything else. Well, just by bringing over the Kimber cable, the Kimber peanut butter and jelly, I think you probably heard of them, cables. He brought over that Kimber. He brought over some Kimber speaker cable, not the top of the line, okay, Kimber speaker cable. No, I think it was the bottom of the line Kimber cable. He brought that over. He brought over the Conrad Johnson 11A. He brought over a Conrad Johnson preamp, not the 10 that I have, but another preamp underneath the 10. And it blew me away. Now, he did nothing to the speakers. Same speakers, just by changing a few elements, it blew me away. It's like, wow. I would never believed it. The cables and just improving what I had from the Pioneer or the Carver, that these sound good. I remember that day very clearly. He says, do you want the equipment? We'll leave it here and we'll call it a sale. You know, and I remember my wife take me off to the side and said, that's the best that system has ever sounded. I would buy it. That's what my wife said. That's the best it's ever sounded. I would buy it. I wouldn't even hesitate. So, of course, I didn't hesitate. I bought it. But it was a very good lesson that even though the equipment I had was very well made, like receivers, they're very well made. But if anybody remembers, beta machines and your tape machines, when they first came out, VHS and beta machine, they were made like a tank. They were made like a freaking tank, those machines were when they first came out. I had a CD player, a Denon CD player. It was built like a tank. You would open it up and they had copper shielding certain parts of the CD player and the transport. And it was very well built, unbelievable. Today, to make a CD player as good as what they made that one, it probably cost you $7,000. Very well. I hated getting rid of that. I really did, because it was so well built. I saw it. Copper shielding, everything. They went the whole 9 yards to make this sound good. Unfortunately, I gave it up because sonically, it couldn't compete with the new stuff. It just couldn't. And I hated getting rid of it because it was beautiful equipment, very heavy, very well made. I remember they had a power supply on the outside of the CD player. Yeah. It wasn't inside the CD player. It was on the outside. You had this black bump on the outside, and they were using the CD player's back wall as a shielding against the power supply. I mean, that's the thought that went into this CD player, that I thought the engineers really did a good job. Sometimes we got to let go of stuff that finally becomes obsolete. Now remember, the CD player was probably bought in the 80s. This is already the 90s. So at that time, I think audio hit its precipice. And I realized that a lot of people like these receivers and stuff. And like I said, the 2500 Marantz, it's just a beautiful piece of equipment, I think. I know others may say different. And even when I look at my old Pioneer, it's a beautiful piece of equipment. And I was the guy who always liked knobs and switches and buttons and meters and beep, 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 beep. You know, hey, I love that stuff. I was all into that, you know, from what I had to do when I was in the military, because I handled all that stuff. But I loved it. So, you know, they put an oscilloscope on that, and it was like, I'm in audio heaven. But it all gets superseded. They were middle of the road equipment. And two, like I said, I finally heard the good stuff. And I'm only saying this because everything gets superseded eventually. But some stuff, it's a lot harder to supersede it over time. Like receivers got superseded. Today's receivers don't sound as good as the old receivers. So if you're comparing receiver and receiver, I'd say the old receiver is going to sound better. I mean, that's hands down. You know, you're going to spend $400, $500, $600 on a receiver. I'm sorry, the old receivers sounded a lot better than the new receivers of today. But other than that, if you get into separates, some separates made it as being excellent. Mark Levinson, Conrad Johnson, Jeff Rowland, Krell. These will be always, because they were so well made, they used top-notch electronics, capacitors, everything else. They always use you couldn't say they use the ultimate best, because they would just cost way too much. And if they have a price point, but they use, compared to other pieces of equipment, they use far superior electronics in them than a lot of your equipment uses. Even today, the electronics in those are better. And that was something that came to a shock to me when I got, of course, the DA converter from Macintosh, which is brand new, and I still prefer the Premier 9 over the brand new Macintosh. It just sounds to me better. Okay, that's subjective though. That's off of my system using Kimber cable and everything else. It just to me sounds more musical and better, no matter what new chips, no matter what new technology that Mac has in it. It's still, I go back to the old hand doing everything, hand turning everything with the old DA converter Premier 9. It just sounds better to me, even though it was bought in the 90s. And these are all subjective opinions I'm giving you. One person may say it's bad. One person may say clip speakers sound terrible. Another person may say they sound great. One person may look at my LTEX and say, oh, they sound terrible. Another person may say, best horn speakers I've ever heard. In fact, they used to beat up on horn speakers until Avantgarde came out with their speakers. I think I've explained this in some other videos. And once Avantgarde, at a very expensive price from Germany, came out with the Avantgarde, all of a sudden, horn speakers started changing of, oh, these sound pretty good. But before, horn speakers were always given a mediocre review. Never, wow. It was always, well, you know, the sound staging, and you are there instead of you're watching it, and they don't have the depth. You know, I can go on and on. Horn speakers are for particular kind of people who want horn speakers. I went to the show, and they had some beautiful horn speakers. I've seen $1 million systems. There was one system that was $4 million, but really it was $1.5 million. It was because of the Chinese lacquer that they had on the horns that brought it up to $4 million. But anyhow, I listen to these systems and they sound very good. The expensive systems to me are really sound pretty good. You can't beat them. I can't really say I heard a big problem child at the show like I did in Florida, where I did hear a set of horns that they need to tune. They need to tune them a little bit better than what they are. That's what I'm saying. Otherwise, everything sounded okay, good. Some sounded very good, but they had a very good price to them and some very expensive equipment backing them in that review that I give. This one was the same way. It was no different. The good systems, very expensive systems with very good equipment backing them up that most of us can't afford. And I'll be honest with you, I can't afford that equipment. It's gotten outrageous. The prices have, and I have to admit it. It's like, holy cow, these are getting to the price of owning an automobile just to listen to music. But I can't really say that all these sounded great, that maybe I didn't hear the same thing in 1999, where I walked in and heard some very great systems, and I was very impressed with it. And I have to admit that, where you walked in and, yeah, but those speakers cost $175,000 back in 1990, but it sounded great. They all do. I kind of think to myself, holy cow, where is this hobby going? We have all these years of technology and improving things, and yet I can't really say I walk into these shows and I'm literally just blown away. Where I could say, man, I gotta have that. That sounds that good. I can't really say that. Don't get caught up in that. Don't get on that train where people are telling you what you should be hearing. And I think that's what happens. I'm seeing that more on YouTube. They're basically, everything's a great review. Everything's great. And not everything is great. There are some mediocre stuff out there, and it's designed to appeal to a certain audience who can only afford so much. Let's just face facts. If I listened to all the reviewers, I would have got rid of my LTECs 20, 30 years ago. If I listened to the reviewers. And that's what I'm kind of telling you. Take what a reviewer says with a grain of salt. Remember, they're given a piece of equipment, given it to them to make a good review. And not all reviewers give decent reviews, and now we're starting to find out that manufacturers are getting all girly on them, like a little girl with a skin neat and wanting to sue them because, oh, how dare you say that about our speakers. It's like the guy's just telling you the truth. I've known that happen to a few YouTubers where they have had manufacturers get mad at them because they didn't get that perfect review. Well, like I said, I don't hear anything after almost 25 years that I could say, wow, except for the very expensive equipment. Very expensive equipment. So you got this big gap in between the extremely expensive equipment and equipment that's less expensive. You got this big gap in there of all kinds of equipment that get into high-end part of the equipment that sounds good, and your cabling and things like that. And then you got all what's below that, which is in the middle of the road. Now, it doesn't mean it sounds bad, but it doesn't sound great, and it may not sound impressive. But doesn't mean it sounds bad, because you can go to any one of these shows and you'll listen to a lot of systems that sound good. And I even admit it. Oh, it sounds good. Is it impressive? No. It just sounds good. But I remember saying that the year before, and the year before, and the year before. It sounds good, but it's not impressive enough for me to stop and say, wow, that's pretty impressive. In the Florida show, I was impressed with the Western Electric 300B. I was impressed with that particular integrated amp on how it sounded. But once again, it's an integrated amp. I know people will pick on it and they'll tear it apart. But I'm just talking about sound quality with the 300B tubes. I was impressed with that. I thought, this sounds pretty good for my ears. Remember, it's subjective. You may listen to it and say, no, I don't like it. But for me, I thought I could see this hooked up to very efficient horns or something, and it would probably take you back into the 30s and 40s when they had tube equipment with these voice of the theater speakers in the theater. It would take you back to those days because that's what they used. 300B tubes and 6550s and stuff like that. That's what they used. And that's what you would be hearing. And because of the distortion levels are so low and stuff, it appeals to us as people. It appeals to us. I think maybe that's why I kind of like the clip speakers. I know I'm going to get beaten up about that, but because maybe the distortion levels are so low, they're so efficient that you could use that first 2 or 3 watts of power, and that's it. You don't need the rest. You can use where the amplifier is putting out the best amount of music and those first few watts. And I remember Paul Clips said, what we need is a real good 5-watt amplifier. Tube amplifier. That's what you need. He knew you don't need to get higher and higher and higher in power. And that was another thing when you had these receivers. You got to look at these receivers as your cars. Let's take cars, for example. Back then in the 70s, they were making muscle cars. And these muscle cars, no, they weren't Ferraris. They weren't Lamborghinis. They weren't your Maseratis. They weren't your Austin Healey's or anything. They were just muscle cars. A lot of horsepower going in a straight line. Okay? That's what the American cars did. Straight line, a lot of horsepower. You want to do zigzagging? No, they weren't built for that. They were built to have all this horsepower. The muscle cars were straight line. That's what they were. That's the same way as they started doing in the 70s with receivers. They were making them with lots and lots of power. They weren't built particularly for sound quality. They were built for power. And then the next guy had to beat that guy with a more powerful amplifier. The next guy had to beat that guy with even a more powerful. And that's how the receivers went. Basically, I look at receivers as muscle cars. And they were. It was like, wow, they're getting up there with so much power and amperage that it was incredible. But they weren't concerned about giving you the highest fidelity out of that piece of equipment, because there were other manufacturers in the 70s starting up, like Conrad Johnson and Mark Levinson and Jeff Rowland, that started making beautiful equipment that really sounded good compared to what we had. Yeah, they were expensive. They were expensive. So anyhow, I thought I'd just do this video that I did go to the show. So until next time, this is the Empirical Audiophile. Happy listening, and thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.